Welcome to Smokin' Science, the podcast hosted by our team at Smokin' All, where we discuss and break down the science of cannabis with two PhD scientists. I'm Andy.
And I'm Miyabi.
And I'm Riley. What's up, everyone? Our team has been up to a lot of exciting things lately, and we want to give you a quick update.
First off, we are hosting a webinar on 4/22/22 that is focused on the pharmacology of cannabis smoke. This webinar is limited to the first 100 people who register, and we wanted to give our dedicated podcast listeners the first dibs on spots before asking the rest of the internet if they want to join.
We should also probably mention free stuff is awesome, and this webinar is completely free.
So if you would like to attend the first ever formal webinar given by Team Smokin' All, go to tinyurl.com/smokinalllive. We'll drop the link in the comments. We're going to talk for about an hour and have time for questions at the end as well. So hope to see you there.
All right, our next exciting piece of news is we have recently released a product, which is a hemp smoke extract tincture. This product contains CBD mainly, but it also contains some minor cannabinoids such as CBN and CBT, which provide a really unique feeling. This product is hemp derived, so it's completely legal to purchase online. If you want to try our limited release of this product, you can find it at profoundnaturals.com.
Again, that's profoundnaturals.com. There might be a little bit of confusion as to why we're selling this through profoundnaturals.com rather than Smokin' All. In short, it was the easiest way for us to legally sell because this company, actually it's called Smokin' All Day Incorporated. That's what our hemp processing license is. It's completely separate from any of our social media platforms or other things that we talk about.
And we are smoking all day, just if anyone's wondering.
Natural products are a difficult subject when dealing with the FDA, but we're happy to find a happy medium where we can sell products and still share information. Anyways, speaking of natural products, this podcast is not only about cannabis, it's about other natural products as well. Today, we're going to deviate from plant medicine and focus on fungi.
We are so excited to have a special guest, a mushroom expert, a social media educator, and a friend of ours, Dr. Gordon Walker, aka Fascinated by Fungi on TikTok and Instagram. He's also a fellow UC Davis Aggie, and we are so excited to have him on, and we're ready to get started.
Woo!
Welcome to Smokin' Science, the podcast hosted by our team at Smokin' All.
Hi, I'm Dr. Gordon Walker. I am fascinated by fungi on social media. I have a PhD in biochemistry from UC Davis, where I studied the dynamics of yeast and bacteria and how that related to sort of wine quality. After graduating, I was in New Zealand for a little while and didn't end up teaching the way I thought I would, and instead just went for a whole bunch of hikes and kind of rekindled a childhood interest in mushrooms. And once I realized I had hundreds of mushroom photos on my phone, I was like, I got to do something with these. So I started a mushroom only Instagram. And my real goal with all of this was to originally just teach myself sort of mushroom by mushroom. And I realized as I went along that I was reaching so many people that I had sort of a little bit of a responsibility to teach others. And then I had a desire to put good information out into the world and try to bring the scientist perspective to the sort of world of mycology. But it was all in the sort of goal and auspices of trying to get people more interested in nature, trying to get them to become better citizens of the world by becoming stewards of their local environments and connecting them to what was happening in the soil beneath their feet in this sort of hidden, cryptic way that would allow them to maybe open their minds to the world of possibility and how amazing fungi are and what an important role they play in the basic ecology of our planet.
That is awesome. And your social medias are just so fun to follow and see all the different colors and shapes of the fungal world. And I just have a question because this is something I've kind of dealt with through graduate school, TikTok, everywhere. Do you think there's a correct way to say fungi, fungi? I've heard so many different ones. I've been criticized. I say fungi, and I just kind of say it with confidence now and hope for the best. But I mean, people criticize me all the time. So I'm just curious of what your opinion is on that.
My general opinion on pronunciations is that every one of them is correct. if you really want to be a hard ass about it, most of the Latin names should be pronounced as if you were speaking Italian. But because I'm not Italian, I don't feel the need to go fungi all the time. I say fungi and fungi interchangeably, sometimes even in the same sentence, just to kind of mess with people. So it's a little bit about like subverting expectations. And, you know, I like fungi because it rolls off the tongue for me, and because of the like clear pun with the fun guy thing.
I was gonna mention that. It is so perfect for you and just representing everything that you do. And honestly, I do that in cannabis too. Between cannabinoid and cannabinoid, I like to toss them both out there, so we all know that it's okay.
I was just gonna say that because people get get very, very critical, and there is in many of these there's no correct, like very, very correct way of saying it. But thanks for clarifying that, because I've said fungi, I think, but mostly because of maybe the pun, maybe because I was reading it in that in the pun in the fun sense. But actually,
Yeah.
one thing you mentioned that I wanted to touch on was going for walks in nature and this connection between like nature and, as scientists, like all of us with backgrounds in biochemistry, and how that connects. Like this, there's a disconnect, I feel like sometimes, between the teaching of like for you like biochemistry and with yeasts and molds, and then for us with pharmaceutical sciences, for Riley with natural products, and then for me with the systems in our bodies. There's this like really big disconnect between the laboratory and nature and the earth and reality. And I was just wondering if you would talk about that. And also I was going to ask you if you ever have like partaken, since our podcast is about cannabis and cannabis science, and I'm wondering if you're comfortable. Like, have you ever partaken in nature?
Yes, I'm a big fan of nature. So I think the interesting thing, as three of us sitting here as biochemists, we've all been educated with the classic biochemical approach, which was very empirical, right? It was to take something from nature, to isolate it, to bring it back to the lab, to homogenize it, to fractionate it, to test those fractions for activity, to look for enzymes, to crystallize. It was, that's biochemistry in a nutshell. But all of that takes everything away from nature. It is the removal and the systematic stripping away of things to get at like the core elements of what you're looking at. But when you do that, you miss out on the bigger picture. You miss out on community dynamics. You miss out on interactions. And like as science progresses, and the more we learn from, where biochemistry was in the 1950s to where we are now, we realize that biochemistry has sort of that approach, that empirical reductionist approach, doesn't serve us so well when we actually try to understand natural systems, because everything does exist within context. If we took a human being, ripped them off of this planet, stuck them in a cage on a different planet in a tiny little white room, and gave them like a ball for enrichment and said, hey, we're going to study you now, like that human being wouldn't be okay. They wouldn't act normal. They would expect there to be other human beings around them. They'd want more than a ball for enrichment. They'd probably wonder why the heck they weren't on their planet anymore. And so I think this is the interesting thing we see when we look at nature and trying to understand the role of fungi. And to very specifically answer your question, yes, cannabis is fantastic, and I have partaken myself. It's been a big part of my sort of mental health routine.
A quick side note for those of you not on TikTok. When I first made my account, I would say cannabis instead of cannabis to try to get around community guidelines and censorship. It did not work.
And relaxation and other stuff. And it's nice to like be at a point now where we can talk about this because it's legal in the states we live in. It's still like a Schedule 1 legal drug with no purported medical benefits, which I think we can all very much attest is not true. But cheers to it finally getting to a point where we can talk about it.
What you were describing about stripping away of nature to be in the laboratory, that is in essence what both of our PhDs were about. And when Riley and I first met, that was like one of the first things I was like, wow, we have this in common, because I think it's just an assumption for a lot of people that that is the correct mechanism to go about finding beneficial, I guess, compounds.
Well, we get into the routine of studying something. It is the quickest way to publish a paper. It's the quickest way to find an active molecule. And we all know that in academia, publications are currency. You're only as good as your publications in the eyes of academics. So if I was trying to get a 10-year professorship, I'm trying to publish as many structures and as much as activity as I can to get to that point, that goal of mine.
Peer-reviewed scientific publications are the gold standard for explaining your research and explaining your results to the general public and to other scientists. But the problem is that most people can't read scientific journal articles because it's really dry, it's really boring, and the vocabulary is really difficult, and it's not easy to understand even for other scientists that are in tangential fields. Often the papers are also behind a paywall, so they're not even available for the general public. This is just one of many barriers of entry into science that we would like to smash down, and it's one of the reasons why we do this podcast.
You know, a lot of people that are going through that route aren't necessarily trying to understand nature and all the nuances. You know, they're trying to get those publications, which is okay. That might be part of it, but the goal is clear. And as Gordon was saying, you know, nothing exists in isolation in nature, but it's almost how we study everything. And learning new mechanisms to study that complexity is approaching, and it's very, very cool, especially if that's in tandem with ways to visualize that complexity in a way that the public and most people can appreciate and understand. But also people are publishing, maybe they study something in isolation. They isolate an active compound from bacteria or fungi or something like that. And then they start adding that back in to other mixtures of known amounts of things. And that's how we start to understand how the addition of one compound can add to the efficacy of a combination of compounds. And I think that's somewhere that at least natural products is going. And it's very cool, especially in the realm of antibiotic resistance, because we're finding that antibiotics that have lost a lot of their efficacy because they've evolved and they're no longer effective against pathogens. If we take that same antibiotic and we add a compound from a plant or a different microbe, and now all of a sudden it can now kill that pathogen again. We don't always know the mechanism it does this, but we know that adding in an exogenous compound to that previous antibiotic restores the efficacy. It's very, very interesting. And publications like that really give me a lot of faith. All right, that may have sounded like gibberish, but in short, if you have a pharmaceutical antibiotic that is clinically proven to work but loses its efficacy over time due to resistance, when natural products that have weaker antibiotic activity are combined with that pharmaceutical antibiotic, it can help restore the function of the pharmaceutical antibiotic. Because now that microbe doesn't just have one thing to become resistant to, it has many different compounds to battle that work in different ways. Also, this is not something to try at home. This needs to be tested in a laboratory to determine what natural products are the safest and most effective for this purpose.
I would agree. My dad has done some work on that antibiotic question, and I know one of the things he's found is, at least mechanism-wise, we think we know what all these antibiotics are doing, like, oh, and you're inhibiting this certain step of translation or some other sort of molecular process. And more often than not, the actual mechanism of how the antibiotic works is simply by producing reactive oxygen species. It's kind of like watching this machine and just jamming a plug in it and being like, haha, now we're creating a lot of havoc. And of course, genetically, you can evolve around having a plug stuck in you and figure out a different way to do business. And bacteria are great at doing that. That's literally why they are the most populous organisms on this planet. But like you're saying, adding small other things that add a little extra stress on the system rather than just the one single door jam is enough to throw the whole thing into havoc, because trying to evolve around multiple things at once is much harder than trying to fix sort of a single problem, because there's multiple things that you're doing. And so I know when I was in grad school, a lot of what I was looking at was this mechanism of bacteria screwing up yeast and inducing a yeast prion. And so this is sort of an epigenetic heritable element that yeast were not as good at doing fermentation when they had this induced prion. And this is part of why I was looking at interactions between yeast and bacteria, because we were looking at yeast in isolation, trying to figure, why the heck does this happen? And I was like, oh, because in nature, there's bacteria there and they have community dynamics, and there's like a push and pull between that kind of stuff. But I forgot where I was going there. But either way, it's interesting, and I love to see that we're kind of looking at this. You guys know this, the entourage effect, right, of chemistry, and the additive effects of different molecules and how that can kind of compound and affect us in different ways. I think that's so cool that science is finally recognizing that and getting there.
Right. And speaking of the entourage effect with the endocannabinoid system, this is an analogy that you brought up about how like we take this in isolation. You're studying everything in isolation, and that has worked for some things in terms of like antibiotic resistance and what you're describing as a plug. Um, I'll describe it as a silver bullet because in pharmacology, one of the oldest sort of routes that we went about as scientists to find new drugs was by this method where you were looking for a silver bullet. You were looking for one drug that was going to hit one target in the body and it was going to stop whatever disease or symptom or pathology. And the more that we learn about like diseases and the human body and the endocannabinoid system in general, the more we're finding out that it's not as simple as just targeting one single thing. And for many, many chronic disorders and like mental health included, which you also mentioned, it is way more multifaceted than that, way more multivariable. And for that reason, personally, I think that natural products have a huge unexplored benefit in many ways because there's hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of uncharacterized interactions in just one cannabis plant or one mushroom.
Yeah, and Gordon, you mentioned that you use cannabis a lot for your mental health, and seemingly you go outside a lot for your mental health too, right? Do you use those together? Do you use them in like combination? Do you go outside and explore nature after using cannabis? And how do you like to use cannabis? Do you like to smoke it, vape it, edibles? What's your preferred method? If you like to share, you don't have to if you don't want to.
Yeah, no. I'm happy to. I'm just laughing because generally I'm not a functional stoner for the most part. So smoking weed is something I do usually to relax and chill. So more often than not, it's kind of, as John Stewart would say, it's a smokable beer kind of thing for me. So, 5, 6 o'clock, I'll be like, in terms of my use in nature, I kind of like to get where I'm going, get a little situated and start walking around. And often what happens is you go to the woods and I'm looking for mushrooms and I just don't see any. I'm like, damn it, I drove like 2 hours, nothing out here. And I'm kind of kicking the soil. And I'm like, why the hell did I come out here? And I'm like, all right, fine, I'll smoke a little bit. And that allows my eyes to relax, allows me to sort of be present in nature in a way that maybe I'm not otherwise, because otherwise my brain is cycling and that default mode network is kind of just like obsessive, repetitive thoughts, which is, not the healthy place to be. And so having a little bit of cannabis in my system allows me to kind of slow down, to be present. And it's almost like one of those magic eye posters where you're like, you weren't seeing anything, but then suddenly because you've relaxed a bit, you're like, oh, there's a mushroom, there's a slime mold. And then you're like, you're present in nature, you're there, you're down on one knee looking at something. And you just realize that like this one spot, there's like 20 interesting things. And all you had to do was just slow down a little bit. And so for me, that's kind of what cannabis allows me to do, is like be present and just kind of take a deep breath and be where I am.
Wow, that's so cool what you just said about being able to see, basically being able to see more because you're relaxed is essentially, it's a serotonergic. It's related to the serotonin system, and the endocannabinoid system and the serotonin system are so closely linked. It's like, I feel like by activating the endocannabinoid system, it allows like more or different processes to come through in that state, right? To be able to see more things like with more visual acuity or right like without distraction and or maybe just like quieting background noise so that like your conscious thoughts are more in the forefront.
Right, like, oh my gosh, I'm not finding any mushrooms. It starts to stress you out, and then you start to get that tunnel vision. Then all of a sudden, you're able to relax a little bit and say, hey, I'm out here for a good time. If I find something, that's awesome. If I don't, that's okay too. I was able to get outside, get some fresh air, relax. And it's amazing that a plant can provide that relief and almost immediately in the cases of vaping and smoking.
I find it works for me really well as kind of an appetite suppressant in some ways, which I know is like the opposite of what people usually think about with cannabis. And I do still get the munchies sometimes, but yeah.
Me too. I'm on the same page as you. I get the same effect. That's interesting.
Yeah, because cannabis, I've been such a long time user that it has like, I'll use cannabis and caffeine sort of synergistically when I'm out hiking, because I'm like, I'll be out in the woods and I honestly during quarantine I dropped a bunch of weight because I was like, I'm just going hiking and I'm like drinking tea and smoking weed and like not eating for a whole day as I hike around. And if I get really lightheaded, I've got some nuts in my backpack, I can have a snack. But I sort of stopped bringing a sandwich with me because I was like, I don't actually need this. I'm in my mid 30s, my metabolism has drastically slowed down, and I need to eat less. And it's a hard thing to adjust from eating like 3 or 4 meals a day, or eating like you're a teenager, just suddenly being like, wow, I like need some coffee in the morning and maybe a big meal at night. But like outside of that, I don't need that much caloric consumption. And so cannabis is sort of a way that, like, I know people use like smoking cigarettes as an appetite suppressant. When they quit, they gain a bunch of weight kind of thing.
So it's interesting. I had used cannabis for like since I was like in high school, mid high school to now, which is many years, but I consistently used it without taking a tolerance break. But this past year, I was like, I'm going to do a little experiment on myself and I'm going to take a small tolerance break and see how my body reacts to not having cannabis in its system every day. And mind you, I'm not a med patient, so it's not something that I absolutely need for, to reduce pain or for any other reason. But the thing I noticed the most, other than sleep, I couldn't sleep at all. But the other thing I noticed was appetite related, because I also find it to be kind of an appetite depressant. I don't really get hungry a lot, whether I'm using cannabis or not. I just don't get hungry a lot. But when I took that tolerance break, and then I started using cannabis again, the munchies came back like crazy. And I hadn't felt that way in years. Like I haven't got the munchies in years. And then the tolerance break like reset that for some reason in my body. And now I'm back to my normal because, it's been a while. But it was very interesting. I was taking like good notes from that. And my partner, Jake's like, oh my gosh, like you don't usually get the munchies. And I'm like, well, tonight I do. Now, you might be thinking that this sounds like it could have something to do with developing a tolerance to THC. There is evidence that stimulation of cannabinoid 1 receptors stimulates this feeding behavior, aka gives you the munchies. If this is the case, when you develop a tolerance to THC, which activates those CB1 receptors, over time, you may lose some of these receptors as they become down-regulated with more exposure to THC. This would lead to less stimulation of these receptors and possibly less of the munchies feelings. So this definitely could be the case.
So the last time I took a really long tolerance break, I decided I was going to experiment on myself and see how far I could take it and record all of the symptoms that came back from me, like as I went along. I wanted to make sure I wasn't just going to have withdrawal effects and that some of the benefits that I was getting from it was what they were. And then my plan was to reintroduce very slowly, similar to people, how they do elimination diets. I reintroduced the cannabinoids slowly and one by one. And that was one of the ways I found what worked the best for me. But it was really interesting. Going back to the appetite thing, if I don't use cannabis, I don't feel satiation from eating food. So I think about like 2 months in, like well past, like where for tolerance and withdrawal effects, like I did have a little bit of a difficult time falling asleep, relaxing for like the first maybe like couple of months. But I was just had a drink and I was fine. But later on, like much later in, like a few months in, I started realizing that like I was just consuming way more food and I was like, what is happening here? And then I was like really conscious of it. I started tracking it because I was like, this is like a lot, and it was this extreme amount because my body just didn't feel any satiation. And so I would eat until like I physically felt full, which is not a comfortable level of full to be. And then I ended up later stopping the experiment because of sensory hypersensitivity. Like my like skin became super hypersensitive to things, and that took about like 9 months to 10 months. And like I was slowly getting like a bunch of different effects that came back, like that were things that I had experienced in my childhood and in my youth, like before, because similar to Riley, I've been using cannabis for a long time. And it was interesting. So then when I reintroduced them back, I was treating it similar to what you were saying, like about like a mental health medication. I was really intentional about it and was trying to figure out like, what can I do? What is the therapeutic minimum that I can use to get this effect? And I'm at the point now where I feel happy with where I'm at and that I'm certain I'm not abusing it. Or using it as a crutch, although I think it's okay. I think it's okay every once in a while to lean on something. That's also something I think we all should like give ourselves a break with, is like, life can be difficult. So I think it's okay.
Life is difficult. Yeah, it's tough for sure.
Yeah. And on the spectrum of things you could be doing to yourself, with alcohol and other abusive behaviors and things like that. Like cannabis is a fairly low risk thing that has minimal impact on the people around you. You don't hear about anyone getting high and doing like crazy like someone gets high and they sit in their couch for 6 hours. Like it's you're not out there being a menace to society most of the time. So, and yeah, in that sense, I like the idea of like give yourself a break. It's you can examine your own practices, and I think it's really important to be mindful and introspective and ask yourself constantly, why do I do this, or what are my decisions that led me to this? At the same time, it's okay sometimes just to be a little bit high and lean into that feeling.
Absolutely. And just going back to talking about nature more, because it's something I think we can all talk about forever. But apart from using cannabis in nature, just being in nature can also produce some really unique feelings that if you're taking nothing else, you feel differently in nature. And I think there's both a
Mhm.
phytochemical component of that and a philosophical component of that. And this is just my opinion. I'm not like reading from a textbook here, but the phytochemical component, we know that smelling terpenes have an effect on our body, and when we're in nature, we are in a bath of terpenes, and this is there's a term in Japan called forest bathing, which means just going into the forest and taking in the atmosphere, and that there is a therapeutic benefit of this. And a lot of that is due to terpenes in the air. I mean, if we think of if, I have pine trees all around me, and pinene is in the air and it's going in our nose. They're volatile compounds. They're reacting with our body, but it's so much more complex than that. It's not just pinene. There's thousands of compounds in the air. The Japanese Forest Agency, which is run by the government, introduced the term Shinrin Yoku, defined as taking in the forest atmosphere or forest bathing, in 1982. They later implemented the Therapeutic Effects of Forest Plan in 2005, which emphasizes the importance of scientific investigation and aimed to get more research on the validity of forest bathing for human health. And then also just from the philosophical point of view, just you're part of this thing that's bigger than just you. Nature is so complex and so perfect in some ways, but it's also chaotic, and that's okay because it operates perfectly in that chaos. And when you're kind of standing in the middle of it, it's just such a unique feeling, and it's something it's like my church. I just absolutely, when I'm stressed out, when I think everything is going wrong, I'm just like, all right, well, put on my jacket and go stand outside for 30 minutes and just stare at a leaf or stare at a river or, hold a mushroom. Do anything that makes you appreciate the complexity of the world. It's so therapeutic, at least for me.
Absolutely. I mean, it's interesting too as a biologist to go out and view nature because you can be really like simplistic and reductionist about it and just like, yeah, it's a leaf, it's a tree, it's a mushroom, like who cares? Or you can sit there and think about like, wow, every single one of those leaves is like full of chlorophyll and the stromata, and like think about the little mechanisms that you've learned that kind of add depth to that. You can look at the mushroom and think of the mycelium that it came out of and think of the interactions of that mycelium with other mycelium, bacteria, yeast, and the plants that are around you. And yeah, like you said, there is some really powerful chemistry that happens. Is all that the terpenes that we're very well aware of have these like potentially positive effects in like you know uh, go into cell signaling and cell signaling cascades that can affect mood and physiological aspects of our health. And so it is amazing to go spend that time in nature. And like I was saying, to being present, and it's a way to kind of rewire your own brain. And I think we as human beings have gotten, again, we have made ourselves reductionist and shoved ourselves in little boxes and drive around in little boxes, and we go to other little boxes and we see other people who are also stuck in little boxes. And yet we forget sometimes that like, hey, we kind of need nature. Like this is the way we evolved, and we're doing so much that goes against our innate evolution. And what people want to go and eat keto and eat paleo, but then not go out into nature. Like, what are you doing? Like, the natural thing to do is get outside, as they say on TikTok, go touch some grass.
Oh my gosh, 100%. During my PhD, at a point where I almost dropped out of school because my mental health was plummeting, and I was like, all right, I'm done. But
Mhm.
I didn't drop out. But anyway, during that time, I realized I was working these like 12, 14-hour days in the lab, and I never was going outside. And it was it was probably 2 months of this straight. And I wasn't even putting the pieces together that my mental health is related to how much time I'm spending outside. So once I had that epiphany, I was like, okay, that's a change I can make. And then in the middle of the day, every day, I would pack up my stuff and I would just go for a walk. I would go for a 1-2 hour walk, whatever I needed at the time, at the day. And it was amazing what that small change did for my mental health and my life and my productivity. Everything was better after I made that change.
Yeah, I want to point out here that it's really, really common. People think of people with their PhDs as like that this was something that was, I mean, it's something that is incredibly difficult, but a very large number of people who do their PhDs struggle with their mental health during their PhD. And part of it is that work-life balance and, like you're saying, the nature and the relationships. And I want to bring it back to something that Gordon was saying about reductionist thinking and really like boiling down, going into nature, as you were saying, as a biologist, as a scientist. You could be in nature and you could boil it down to the simplest thing, or you could go down your own little personal rabbit hole of your interest. And for me, cannabis and through the cannabis activating the endocannabinoid system, what it does is it inhibits some background noise of like stress. I tend to be more reductionist in my thinking when I'm stressed and when I'm just when I have too many thoughts going on in my head. I tend to then reduce. I try to intentionally reduce what else I'm thinking about. And so for me, cannabis in nature, and outside of nature too, but just in general, helps me to not be as reductionist. It opens my mind a little bit by allowing those background thoughts to kind of fade away, so that I don't need to reduce anything because I'm not like dealing with an overwhelming number of thoughts inside my brain. I think this is one of the reasons why cannabis and nature have such a synergistic effect on my mental health. Because when there's this reduction of these background thoughts, I can appreciate the true beauty of nature. I can hear all of the amazing sounds and see and smell and touch all of the amazing things. And this chemodiversity, this biodiversity, all of this amazing life is something that's worth celebrating and something to be incredibly grateful for. And I'm so grateful that I'm able to feel that way, because it wasn't always that way for me.
And just seeing the complexity of nature, if you see these ecosystems working, you will say, we're never going to understand everything about that. And that is so cool. We just will not be able to understand what's happening here, no matter how hard we try. Like, no matter what tools are developed, nature is more complicated than what we can understand.
Well, we certainly like our natural products. Mushrooms and cannabis go together so good. Now, we'll read a review from our listeners. These are extremely helpful, so keep them coming, people. Thank you.
Today, we're going to highlight a review from Bizownerful.
Bizowner, Florida?
Oh, it's probably that. Well, this person says, I love learning and cannabis science is a natural fit. I'm familiar with some of the topics discussed, but have many aha moments when their relatable explanations and opinions make it all much clearer. Thank you so much.
Thanks for taking the time to write a review for the podcast. It helps us a lot, and we love reading them. And it's also awesome that you're having these aha moments listening to the podcast, because that's one of our absolute favorite things about learning, is connecting these different concepts in new ways. So now we'll hear a quick word from our company, Smoke and All, who sponsors this podcast, and then it's back to the science.
Smoke and All is a unique cannabis extract that feels more like smoking compared to traditional edibles. That's because it's actually extracted from cannabis smoke. Smoke and All can be incorporated into a variety of formulations, including edibles, tinctures, and capsules. And Smoke and All extraction is fast, easy, and requires very little upfront investment. If you work at a dispensary or are involved in cannabis processing and are interested in incorporating Smoke and All formulations for your products, contact the link below or send us a message on Instagram. Smoke and All. We smoked it for you.
If you're looking to try a CBD product with a unique experience, our hemp smoke extract not only contains CBD, but also contains rare cannabinoids such as CBG, CBN, and CBT that are created during the smoking process. Rare cannabinoids equals rare experience. This product is made with smoked hemp, so it is completely legal to purchase and has a slightly smoky flavor because, well, it's a smoked product, which personally I love. My favorite way of using it so far has been adding it to my salad dressings. You can purchase our hemp smoke extract at profoundnaturals.com. That's profoundnaturals.com. Thanks for the support.
There's a lot of mushrooms that will produce melanin in response, to UV, to sunshine. They produce vitamin D as well. So that's one of the cool things. Nutritionally, mushrooms are the only non-animal source of vitamin D, which is something I tell vegans and vegetarians. People are always like, well, what about this thing? I'm like, yeah, they just added vitamin D to it. So if you want an actual source of vitamin D, you go to fungi. And all you have to do if you ever want added vitamin D, because sometimes you'll see in the store, they'll be like mushrooms with extra vitamin D. Just take your mushrooms, stick them in the sun for like 30 minutes. They'll produce all the vitamin D you need. In the ones that in the store it's been added, they just put them under UV lamps before they package them. That's the only thing that they do. And yeah, fungi use melanin a lot. I don't know. Have you guys ever heard of honey mushrooms, armillaria, before?
Oh yeah, isn't
Yeah.
it the largest organism on Earth is a honey mushroom?
Well, it's a giant patch of mycelium. And actually, I went there last October and we filmed like a mini documentary about it. It's like a 3.5 mile wide diameter
What?
patch of Armillaria ostoyae.
Yeah, it's so. You should Google it. Google it.
crazy.
It's so
They,
cool.
yeah, they call it the humongous fungus.
The humongous
Yeah.
fungus. We're gonna add that as a link so people can look it up. 3.5 miles wide. Wow.
It's not actually a giant mushroom. That's what people misunderstand. It's just the mycelium. The cool part about it, though, is that mycelium doesn't usually get that old, because any organism that lives that long, you're right, we have telomeres, so with little sort of like shoelace ends on the end of our genome that can fray, and once that's over, you're toast.
So every single cell in our body contains DNA. At the end of this DNA, what Gordon is talking about are telomeres, which are just at the very, very end. And when our cells reproduce in the body, every time they reproduce, the ends of it can get chopped off a little bit or damaged, and then they get repaired. And the longer and longer your telomeres are, the longer they are before the damage reaches the important part of the genes. And what Gordon's saying is that once the telomeres are all gone, when your cells start replicating, it will start fraying genes and parts of our DNA that we need. And that's why we age. Or I suppose that's just one of the main reasons that we've found that we age, get older, and have problems associated with what is called senescence.
For some reason, the telomeres in this giant patch of mycelium are still intact and still like maintaining. So there's some really cool genetic thing, because this patch is estimated to be like 10,000 years old, and they just don't know why has it sustained. I think there's another giant patch of Armillaria up in Michigan somewhere too. That's not quite as big, but they are still trying to figure out like what is it that allowed this single patch of mycelium to grow for such a long period of time.
Something I find really cool about some fungi, not all of them, but some of them can produce a sclerotia, like a unique component of them that's usually hard and protects them from the environment. So a good example is chaga. If you look at a picture of chaga, you see that the outside is like this jet black color, although the inside is like an orangey, sometimes spongy, depending on the season. Completely different. And that black is the sclerotia that is protecting that fungus, because it's exposed to a lot of light, it's exposed to a lot of stressors in the environment, and it's hard as wood. It is protecting that fungus from the environments, which once you look at one, you're like, yeah, I think if a human grew a sclerotia, it would protect it from almost anything too. It's really amazing. And it has a lot of medicinal value too, because of the concentrated secondary metabolites there.
Talking about nature and the complexity of nature is probably one of like my favorite topics, and how humans interact with that complexity. Like, we talk about chemodiversity all the time, like the total number of molecules that are in something, and natural products, and like a forest, and I mean, just any sort of nature, it has its own chemodiversity. Every organism plays a role and plays a part in it, even after it dies and is being recycled by other organisms, right? Like, you're contributing to this like molecular soup. Soup is an unattractive word. think of a better one. But you're contributing to this like really complicated thing that we interact with, and I just think it's incredible how many molecules there are in nature, and then how many molecules there are in us that interact with it.
I call it the chemical continuum, and the idea that like matter and energy and even reality exist on sort of like a giant gradient smear across the universe. And much like a bell curve or probability, or like even an orbital, like things exist in higher areas of probability, and that's what we can like sense and tell and see and like measure. But there's like things on the outside of that probability curve and outsides of the orbital that like maybe we don't totally understand, but like they can still be there at points in time on that giant chemical continuum that is our reality.
Right, the uncertainty principle out there that we will never understand the entirety of the unknown. I mean, the unknown is like it goes on infinitely because the moment you find out about something, there's going to be some other piece of it that you don't understand. And such is the life of a scientist. Like
We were talking about this a while ago, where it's like the more you become an expert in a very niche subject, the more you understand that you don't know about anything in the world, because every subject you can possibly think of gets that niche, goes down that microscopic, that far. And if I don't even understand my field, then how am I going to understand many other fields, the world, how they work together? I mean, it's incredibly complex in like the most beautiful way. I love the complexity, and I love not understanding everything.
and I love embracing that with other people though, right? Like embracing the idea that we wouldn't understand everything and that you can be humbled by that in nature and like just be standing there and being like this is so incredible and I don't have to understand it to like really appreciate it or benefit from it, but I can choose to try and like make sense of like specific purpose or specific parts of it. And I I just think that that's actually, to bring it back to cannabis, I think that is probably my favorite thing about cannabis is that it is alive and cannabis is a living plant that we have been using, humans have been known to use it at least for rope and fiber. And I mean, we don't have documented medical use until like a little bit later, which was still thousands and thousands of years ago. But I have a hard time believing people were taking the plant and not using all of it when we were hunter gatherers, just because like when you're a hunter gatherer, resources are resources.
And smell attracts hunters and gatherers, and cannabis is a stanky plant.
And I think there's a thing that I see with all the time with mushrooms is, you know, you've seen my video where I like pick a mushroom out of the ground and people are like, oh, you're destroying nature. And I'm like, yeah, man, but like, look at this mushroom. Like, clearly it was attracting attention somehow, right? And just like you talked about truffles, they are literally evolutionarily keyed in to have animals come find them and dig them up. They produce a ton of volatile molecules because the entire life strategy of a truffle, or what they call a hypogeous fungi, something that lives underground, all of them employ the same strategy of producing volatiles and, you know, other things potentially to make animals come dig them up and eat them.
And we are just animals. We like to see ourselves as above animals or not above our animalistic tendencies. But like you said, like something looks good, something smells good. And I mean, you know, I smell a cannabis plant every time I smell someone and I smell those terps. I'm like, ooh, that smells good.
Or sometimes you go, man, that's real skunky. Who's smoking that?
Yeah.
People on TikTok still act like animals sometimes, especially in the comment section. That's for sure. Do you wanna touch upon social media and censorship?
One of the most frustrating things about the social media platforms is that someone could just not like you and report your videos. And then Riley, Gordon, and I have all had experiences where our content is removed and we have no idea why, because we are out here on these platforms to educate and to bring this scientific knowledge to, you know, everyday people. And it's frustrating because, you know, we understand why there are guidelines, but we also become, you know, sometimes just victims to trolls and people who are out there like, intentionally bringing people down. But I understand why all these social medias have community guidelines. I definitely understand the value in protecting the community from harmful information, but man, it is frustrating as like educators and trying to like spread information.
Well, it's it's frustrating because they're not doing what they're supposed to be doing. They're just taking down educational content from random people about subjects that they don't want discussed because they think that it's harmful in some way, when in reality it's harm reduction. And we're getting censored all the time. We're getting platforms removed that we've worked for years to develop. I mean, it's absolutely ridiculous the amount of effort that goes into building that, and to have it just absolutely taken because an algorithm developed by somebody doesn't agree with what they think that your video is saying. And I know that all three of us have been censored heavily on social media, specifically TikTok, which we can start with. I posted a video recently about something psychedelic related, and Gordon had commented on it saying, hey, the mushroom that you have in the background is not a psilocybin containing mushroom. And I just commented back, yeah, I know, because I was scared to put one as the background because I thought TikTok was going to take it down. And then Gordon, you've had videos removed that people thought they were psilocybin containing mushrooms, so they reported it, or do you want to expand on that at all?
Yeah, I have had tremendous amount of content reported as being illegal or regulated goods. And it's insane to me because I have made like 1 or 2 videos about psilocybe mushrooms on TikTok. And while they were reported, one of them was eventually like reinstated because it was a very much an educational thing. I was talking about legality of them, and I wasn't talking about like how to find them or how to take them or anything like that. And so it felt decent that that piece of educational content was out in the world. But I haven't made anything more because, yeah, like many of my videos have just been like tagged, or especially my live sessions when I was going on and just showing people mushrooms, they'd be like, this has to be dangerous. This has to be illegal. And I mean, the other thing too is this is a thing we can think about with TikTok, especially, is the demographics we're serving are children, literal freaking children. And this is a thing that was reminded to me because I was sort of complaining about some of the issues I've had with censorship, complaining about people leaving mean comments on my videos. And my friend was like, yeah, I'm a teacher. She's a teacher at like a Waldorf school. And she's like, those friggin' 13-year-olds are just so mean because they don't have enough like emotional maturity to, really say anything more than just, I don't like that, you suck. All they know is they have sort of strong opinions, but not much to base it on. And I was like, oh, right. That's the demographic that we're primarily interacting with on this app. So, and there's a level of anonymity there too, where they're able to say whatever they want to you. And you look at their profile and it's a bunch of like memes or like K-pop or something. And I was like, this is like not my generation. I don't understand what this stuff is.
I think it's funny that you mention 14-year-olds because I think the rules changed on TikTok that you're supposed to be 14 now to create an account, and nobody younger than that's allowed on the app, which of course I'm sure there are much younger people that just say they're 14. But I used cannabis for the first time when I was 14. I would have killed for some cannabis education. And of course, it probably wasn't there at the time I was 14. But, when people think that this information shouldn't be shared with people this young for XYZ reasons, I think it's the perfect age to start teaching about cannabis education and about other psychedelic, about drug interactions with your body. When was the first time you learned how a drug interacted with your body? It probably wasn't at 14. It was probably much later than that. And I think we should be targeting the 14-year-olds. That might be radical.
No, I agree. Well, okay. I love how Riley goes, that might be radical. And I go, no, I agree. Like as if I'm not a radical. So geez. But the first time I learned about drugs interacting with the body was when I was in undergrad starting my research career. In pharmacology. And I can't believe that. I think we should teach it at the same time that we teach sex ed, which is actually a bit younger. Or so let's say this, instead of going the recreation, like instead of talking about recreational drugs like cannabis or whatever, like you could start by talking about cough medicine and like safety, also poison. Like I was never actually really taught what a poison.
Birth control, like everything.
Oh, that's going to open a whole nother can there with that one. But no, I totally agree. Like, and specifically like education and harm reduction, but also just taking the harm reduction aside. Like, let's just talk about education and about the three of us being passionate scientists, passionate about what we like to do and educate about. I've had so many people comment on my videos and things saying things like, you're such a great teacher. And it's like, well, because I'm talking about something that I love. And I love that. And, it's unfortunate, but many teachers are overworked, underpaid, or for whatever reason. And also many teachers just don't love to teach anymore. It's really, really hard. And many scientists, we're not trained to be teachers. Like when we become scientists, we're not trained how to teach. And so, like getting this information out there and showing like a younger audience that you can follow your passions into things that you're passionate about and like
I mean, I would love to talk about that stuff because for me, yeah, I started drinking and using cannabis in high school. And that's not necessarily like a good thing. It's not something I would recommend to people, but it's just the reality of where I was at. And a lot of kids, similar to what you were talking about, Riley, is like that's your exposure. And if you don't have any education on it, it's similar like if you have only abstinence, only education, you can make really big mistakes with sex. And you can do the same thing with drugs and alcohol. If you have no education, you have no context, it is easy to make a mistake. And yeah, we'd love to think, oh, kids don't do this stuff till they turn 18. But the reality is they do. They have access to it and it happens. For me, I know that like a lot of and this sounds weird, but a lot of my interest in science came directly out of getting kind of loopy in high school, getting drunk, getting high, and being interested because I had a sort of deep-seated interest in science. I was like, I wonder if I like turn my scientific eye, my critical analytical eye to what I'm doing on weekends and at night when I'm all messed up. But it's fun to kind of explore that. And I became a super nerd on alcohol, which led me to brewing in college, which led me to researching yeast physiology and mechanisms of fermentation in graduate school, which then led me to somehow being a mushroom expert.
I want to quickly say that even though we're not endorsing that we think that other people should go out here and do this, I do think it's important for visibility to just say that we're three scientists here with our PhDs who all smoked weed in high school, and that I agree that it played a critical role for me. Like I hear so much of myself in your story about how it drove you to be your interests and your passions to become a scientist. I was learning about enzymes, the machinery in our body that do all of the chemical reactions. I started learning about enzymes the same week that I smoked weed for the first time, and I ended up doing my PhD on an enzyme. And I think that there's, in terms of creativity and opening of the mind, and I'm not none of us are out here advocating aggressively that this is the best possible thing, but on the flip side we're also saying, hey, like we're here and potentially contributed well to like our creativity and our life paths, and I think it's possible. So I'm listening to this while I'm editing it, and I think I need to double down on this, at least for myself. I don't think it's just possible that cannabis contributed to my creativity, contributed to my interest in looking into pharmacology, into understanding neurodiversity, and into understanding myself. It's not just possible. I know for a fact, at least about myself, that it's true, that cannabis played a central role in that. And I know it's a little bit of a touchy subject, but I genuinely believe that being passionate about something comes from that experience, and it comes from something that is deep within yourself, something that has touched you in your past that has made you want to dedicate your life towards something. And to me, that can only be a good thing in the community and in the ripples that you make in the community. So I really wanted to share that while I'm not advocating for it, and I'm not saying that it's okay for anyone else, I am just stating the fact that I am certain and I am positive that cannabis was a positive for me. All right, we talked for quite a while, so we're probably going to release a bonus episode or maybe do a part 2, but you can find Dr. Gordon Walker at Fascinated by Fungi on Instagram or TikTok. You should definitely go check him out.
Thanks for listening, everyone. As a reminder, this is totally free, this webinar that we're putting on. The Pharmacology of Smoke will be on 4/22/22, and it's completely free. But it will be capped at about 100 listeners. So reserve your spot now at tinyurl.com/smokeandalllive. We'll throw the link in the description.
We are really excited about this one because it's going to be the first ever formal webinar by Team Smoke and All. So if you like listening to the podcast and you want to hear about our research topic, which is what happens when you smoke flower, come on down. We look forward to talking with you. And if you're interested in trying our hemp smoke extract, you can find it at profoundnaturals.com.
Although we sell Smokinol hemp products, we still do license our technology to those working with high THC cannabis who want to manufacture products with Smokinol. If you're interested in working with us, please email us at sales@smokinol.com. That's sales@smokinol.com.
We would like to give an extra special thanks to Jen Domsky, Bizona, Florida, Butterbeans, Literally Zero Pizza, MM030381, Layman Stupid App, LJM420, Samsonite 55, Felly Cab, Abso Fruitly, John the Bow, Cutie 1994, Old Geek 1, CJ Sloan, Tony Rome, Beth in New Hampshire, LaPlaya 34, Maya 1722, Zzz, Pimental Portfolio, CK Dascam, Airbender Andy, James T84, Sync 1, Cool Bean King, C52XC, Surge Near, someone from New Zealand, Gerson, Tabs 24, John Van Dyke, and Telfer C. These dedicated listeners took the time to write us a review, and honestly, it really makes a difference and makes our day. We text them to each other whenever we get a new one. So thank you so much.
Thank you, everyone who's written a review. Mad love, friends. Thank you for the support, and we will see you at the next Smokin' Science Sesh.